This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Ritula Shah. Thank you for downloading the World Tonight podcast on Monday the 14th of October. The Queen's speech has set out a new legislative agenda, but meanwhile the Brexit negotiations have been carrying on in Brussels. We try to untangle what may be up for discussion there and debate why Labour's leadership appears to be divided about its next steps. Also, there are protests in Barcelona after 9 Catalan separatist leaders are sentenced to imprisonment for their role in the 2017 independence referendum. So what will the Catalan government do now? We'll hear from the winner of this year's Booker Prize, and Poland's Law and Justice Party has won a second term in office, but we find out why the opposition are putting a brave face on their defeat. You're listening to The World Tonight with Ritula Shah.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government's priority has always been to secure the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union on the 31st of October. My government intends to work towards a new partnership with the European Union based on free trade and friendly cooperation.
Crowns, tiaras, wigs and gowns. The Queen's speech setting out the government's legislative agenda was delivered amid the usual pomp and flummery today. But given that the Prime Minister doesn't have a majority, many of the 26 bills set out in the state opening may not become law. The speech, though, could be seen as a draft Conservative manifesto for a looming election. But anyway, the real action was elsewhere. Somewhere in a Brussels meeting room, officials from the UK and the EU are thrashing through what might be the basis of a Brexit deal. There have been no leaks from the talks, although we do have an outline of the broad areas up for discussion. The negotiators need to reach agreement before Thursday's 2-day summit of EU leaders begins. This is the last such meeting currently scheduled before the Brexit deadline on October the 31st. But speaking to Euronews, the Irish Foreign Minister said the UK would need to show more flexibility in the coming days.
Clearly yesterday we were not in a place where we were close to a deal. So let's hope we've made more progress today. The UK need to move to facilitate an agreement, in my view. And I think if they do, they'll get a very generous response from the EU side and from an Irish perspective too. I mean, we all want a deal. And I think there is an understanding as to what that deal can look like by those involved in negotiation. But actually getting the technical language and legal language right that stands up to being an international treaty, which is what this will need to be, is a real challenge.
Well, Jennifer Rankin is The Guardian's Brussels correspondent, and she joins me now. Good evening.
Good evening.
Jennifer Rankin, remind us of what we know is in these proposals.
Well, what we know about the proposals largely comes from the EU side, as the UK have given very little away, and indeed neither side want to say very much while these technical talks are ongoing. But basically, the proposals are trying to solve the problem of how can the whole UK leave the EU customs union, which is what Boris Johnson wants, while keeping the open border on the island of Ireland. And currently what is under discussion is a model where the UK or where Northern Ireland would be legally in the UK customs zone, but practically in an EU customs zone. So it's become known as a sort of Schrodinger's Brexit, just as the cat was dead and alive at the same time. Northern Ireland would be legally in the UK zone, but practically in the EU zone, and that is following EU policy on tariffs and quotas at seaports.
OK, so far so clear. Well, let's go through a couple of the issues that have been raised by the Europeans when these proposals have been discussed. The first is the issue of the rebate. What's that?
Yes, so that would allow, for example, a Northern Ireland wholesaler, if they wanted to import clothes from China, when those goods would arrive at, say, the port of Larne, they would be paying EU tariffs on those goods. But then as a Northern Ireland business in the UK customs zone, they could apply for a rebate from the government. So it's quite a good illustration of how this proposal could work in practice and why that the government thinks it should work in practice. Although it's worth remembering that this is a sort of pared down version of an idea first tested by Theresa May, except she wanted it to apply to the whole UK. And when she presented that idea, back in 2017, Boris Johnson said it was crazy, and the European Commission said it was part of a sort of set of ideas that was a magical thinking on the UK's part. So it is seen by the European Commission as something that has a lot of problems, as something that's very bureaucratic and would involve a lot of form filling for businesses. But the UK government would argue that it's more manageable, given that it would only be covering the territory of Northern Ireland, not the whole UK.
Another issue then is the rules of origin. Why might that be a problem?
Well, we know this issue has been discussed by EU negotiators. This is something very much on their agenda. And this is, how do you treat goods, say ingredients or components of finished products? How do you treat these kind of goods once they're in the sort of Schrodinger's Brexit customs union? So, for example, if you're a Northern Ireland company, you import sugar from Brazil, and then you want to use that sugar to make fizzy drinks to export into the Republic of Ireland. So how do you treat the sugar in the sugary drink when it comes to customs tariffs and rules? So that's a one sort of problem that the EU has identified, and it's something that they want the UK to come up with answers today, tomorrow, as these talks continue.
Peter Foster from the Daily Telegraph suggesting that perhaps there are more optimistic noises emerging from Brussels tonight. But in your view, is a third, however good or well things may be going, is a third extension inevitable?
I'm also hearing people talking about cautious optimism, but nonetheless, I think that the hurdles are high, and that if the government does want to pursue this elaborate customs model, which for the EU is untested, is very complex to agree, to administer, and also not going to be operational, ready to put into practice as soon as would be needed, then I think that's going to be very difficult to do, if not impossible, by the 31st of October for Brexit on that day. Indeed, senior EU diplomats have said it's just not possible to negotiate such a complicated arrangement in a few days. However, if the UK wanted to return to some of the off-the-shelf ideas that the EU had offered previously when it comes to solving this border issue, especially above all the Northern Ireland only backstop, a variance on that, they think that would be possible. Okay. But they now think this kind of very complicated idea, there just isn't enough time to do it. If that means Brexit on the 31st of October. So that means you do get into talking about an extension.
Jennifer Rankin, thank you very much. The Brexit conundrum has divided both the main parties. For Labour, the protracted road to leaving the European Union is opening up differences between those who want a referendum before an election and those who argue that if a deal is brought to the Commons at the weekend, they want to vote it down and follow up with a swift vote of no confidence, a Brexit extension, and then an election. And these differences appear to have reached the very top of the party, with advisers close to Jeremy Corbyn favouring an election sooner rather than later, while those around the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, are pressing for a referendum ahead of a general election. Additionally, Jeremy Corbyn's powerful Chief of Staff, Carrie Murphy, was moved to Labour's HQ recently. This has been widely interpreted as an attempt to sideline some of Mr Corbyn's key defenders, who also oppose campaigning on a Remain platform in any general election. Well, in the Commons, the Prime Minister deflected attention from divisions on his own side and compared Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell's apparent tensions to Trotsky's rivalry with Lenin in Soviet Russia.
We can all see the Soviet-era expulsions that are taking place in his circle, as one by one his lieutenants are purged, as Lenin purged the associates of poor old Trotsky. And there is Lenin, Mr. Speaker, the veteran fabricator of GLC budgets, as the Shadow Chancellor tightens his icy grip on the Labour Party. The contrast becomes ever starker.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell are long-standing friends and political allies, but do these reports indicate real volatility in and around the leader's office? And what impact might this have on the electability of Labour? Dawn Foster is a columnist for the left-leading Jacobin magazine, and Neil Lawson is director of Compass, a left-of-centre pressure group. They're both here with me now. Good evening. Good evening. Neil Lawson, tension at the top, possibly. If so, why? These two men are really long-standing friends, allies, through their journey through Labour.
Yeah, and I always thought this was smoke and mirrors stuff, kind of tough tough cop, good cop kind of stuff. But actually, there's real casualties now. Andrew Fisher was a real casualty who left with some real vehemence he talked about the kind of lack of human decency in the leader's office.
And he was a senior advisor.
Yeah, Carrie Murphy is another kind of casualty. And now this is looking like more than just the normal kind of nuts and bolts and twos and fros of an office. And I think the thing about Jeremy was always a figurehead, not really a CEO. But because of Labour's position in the polls and Jeremy's particularly poor polling, that stuff is coming to the surface. It's combined with tensions, as you said, over Brexit and when to go and how to go and whatever else. And underneath all of that, I mean, I'm sorry, but, I don't like to say this, but there is some truth to what Boris Johnson said. There's always been two camps going back a long way in and around the left of the party, a more Stalinist camp and one more favourable to more Trotskyist politics. Now, you can't deny that lots of people come from that baggage. So in the circumstances, all of these differences are now bubbling up as the election looms and the aftermath of the election and who kind of takes over the leadership. And it's not a good time to do this stuff, obviously.
Dawn Foster, is John McDonnell the man really in charge?
No, I don't think so at all. I think Jeremy Corbyn has always had a very different style of leadership to some of his other, Boris Johnson, to the leaders of the Liberal Democrats, etc. And I think they've always worked together very, very well. So often when there are discussions within the party, everybody puts forward their ideas, but Jeremy Corbyn will always make the final call. And, Andrew Fisher pointed out that he had a lot of problems within the party. And I think that whenever you have these very high-pressured, high stakes, very, very, you're working very, very long hours, you always get a lot of these office politics. But I think, Carrie Murphy hasn't been culled, so to speak. She's been moved to, another different part of the, party mechanism, because we're gearing up for a general election. So she'll still be very close and very, very high up, because they're gearing up for a general election.
But office politics are one thing, and we're talking about names, Carrie Murphy, Andrew Fisher, that people who aren't real political geeks might not, ever even have heard of. But there are real policy differences emerging here, aren't there?
I can't really see many particular real policy differences.
It's a question of whether there's a referendum before an election or an election before a referendum, or if there's a referendum at all.
Well, there has been a big discussion about this, but Labour's policy is very, very clear. They want to see a general election so that Labour can possibly negotiate a new Brexit deal and then put it to the people. It's always about putting it to the people. Whereas if you call a general election now, you risk crashing out with a no-deal Brexit. So Labour's policy is to at any cost, avoid a no-deal Brexit.
Neil Lawson, you're shaking your head. And the other question that I would have asked is, is this actually potentially going to put off voters if they see a sort of slightly divided leadership and questions about Jeremy Corbyn's future?
Well, it doesn't bring me great pleasure, but, the fact is that different politicians from the shadow cabinet are briefing completely different things about what Labour's strategy should be around Brexit, about whether we should have the referendum before or after a general election. I mean, that is a huge strategic issue, and John Trickett's saying one thing, and other people are saying, Long Bailey saying something else. Now, that is a huge, and everyone in the country is listening to that and can hear that, and that matters enormously about what Labour's position is, and there is no clarity. And I think going into an election with that kind of music behind you is really bad.
Rebecca Long Bailey, Dawn, is someone who has been tipped as a potential Labour leader. So for her to perhaps contradict Jeremy Corbyn even slightly, as she appeared to do on Andrew Marr yesterday, is significant, isn't it?
I think it's still relatively, a small detail. I think it's very, very unlikely that Boris Johnson agrees to put a deal to the people. And Labour have been very clear. Rebecca Long Bailey has been clear. Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell have all been clear. They want to see they want to see a general election, and then after that, they want to see the people decide whether or not to remain in the UK or accept a potential deal that Labour could negotiate.
But there are plenty of people talking about the possibility of a referendum first and an election second, and some of those people are people around John McDonnell, which is quite the opposite of what you're saying.
But very, very few people in the Conservative Party are putting that forward, and I think it's, I can't think of one person within the Conservative cabinet who's come out and said that they're willing to go for a second referendum.
So let's imagine for a moment, and there are lots of ifs in this, that there is some kind of deal. by Thursday, by Friday, and there is Super Saturday in the Commons. What are the chances then, do you think, that Labour could attach some kind of confirmatory referendum to any deal that might be put before MPs on Saturday?
Look, I think let's see what Boris comes back with, but I think there's a good chance that a number of Labour MPs could vote for a deal because they think it's right for their constituency and they think it's right for their country. What I don't want to see is those people treated with vitriol because, you know, they're doing what they think is right and compromising. I think the leadership, some in the leadership, would certainly like to see those Labour MPs vote through a deal because they want to get Brexit out of the way and want things to return to a domestic agenda.
And a confirmatory referendum?
Well, I still don't think that there's any majority in the House for that to happen, certainly if some sort of Brexit deal goes through. So, you know, the Labour's position is one thing, but across the whole of the House of Commons, I can't see a majority for a referendum.
Briefly, Dawn?
I agree. I don't think there is a majority for a confirmatory referendum, and I don't think that there will be a deal on Saturday.
Plenty to think about. Dawn Foster, Neil Lawson, thank you both very much. Well, back in the Commons today, Labour, along with the other opposition parties, branded the Queen's speech a pre-election stunt. 22 new bills were outlined during the state opening, with many focusing on law and order, as well as immigration and the environment. The Conservatives' electoral strategy seems fairly clear: to win over voters in Labour seats which are strongly pro-Leave, particularly in the north of England and the Midlands. One obvious target seat is Dudley North. Labour won the seat by just 22 votes at the last election, putting it firmly in the Conservative sights. So will tough policies on crime persuade people there to put their cross against a Conservative candidate? The World Tonight's Paul Moss went to ask.
I met Brenda Newman on Dudley's main high street with her friend Barbara. A quick trip to the shops, she said, and then off for a cup of tea. Did she, I asked, have any particularly strong feelings about crime? Well, yes, it turned out.
There is no deterrent, is there, for the young ones? They've all got knives now, all shapes, sizes. I think it should be a stiffer sentence.
Do you mind me asking how you voted in the last election?
Well, I voted Labour.
So if the Conservatives were to introduce tougher sentences for criminals, do you think that could win you over to them?
I'd vote for them, yeah.
How about you, Barbara? Is crime something you worry about?
Yes, definitely. I saw it on the news. 2 youths beat up an 80-year-old man and his wife. That is bad, isn't it?
So do you think tougher sentences for criminals is the answer?
Well, you give them a cell, they have 3 meals a day, play tennis, play football, they ain't being punished, are they?
You think that's what prison's like?
I think so, because my brother was in and he loved it.
Your brother was in prison and loved it?
And he loved it. 3 meals a day. I would vote for Conservative.
Over crime?
Yes. All of the elements, apart from his trunk.
Josie was clearing up in a local handicraft shop when I went in. And crime turned out to be a worry for her as well.
Somebody can start an argument with you in the street. You don't know if they've got a knife on them or not.
Would it make you more likely to vote Conservative if they were, as they see it, tougher on crime?
Yes, and I think they ought to bring the death penalty back.
Reintroducing the death penalty may not be current Conservative Party policy, although in fact the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has expressed support for it in the past. But here in Dudley North, the Conservatives only need a very small swing to take the seat at the next election. And promises of longer spells inside for violent offenders, some believe that might just do the trick.
There probably is quite a bit of anxiety amongst the public in relation to specifically things like violent offences such as knife crime. So yeah, I think some of these proposals will carry some weight when it comes to influencing the public in terms of who they vote for.
Liam Brolin is a lecturer in criminology at nearby Birmingham City University. He says it's not just a case of the Conservatives having more appeal with tough policies on crime. It's also that their supporters are more likely actually to get up and vote when law and order has been placed prominently on the party's agenda.
I think the timing is convenient in relation to where we are politically right now. If we do have a general election looming, crime and criminal justice certainly is a topic that gets people emotive and it encourages them to participate in the political process.
Crime, and particularly violent crime, certainly is a problem in Dudley. There have been a couple of high-profile murders in the town recently, and although Dudley isn't particularly bad when compared to other parts of the West Midlands, this region as a whole has experienced by some measures the highest rise in violent crime outside London. Well, one man who knows all about this is Malcolm Fowler. He's a criminal lawyer. Malcolm, you spent plenty of time with violent criminals. are they deterred by a threat of tougher, longer sentences?
Absolutely not. The reality is the likelihood of being caught is the only serious deterrent. And yet, the police service has been denuded of funds, and then we are surprised that violent crime and other crime has risen. The only way to stop reoffending, which is the real worry here, is to provide them with that support they've been lacking. Tougher sentences are demonstrated not to work.
We wanted to talk about these suggestions with a local Conservative representative and arranged to meet the Conservative leader on Dudley Town Council. But he didn't turn up, didn't answer his phone, and later said the appointment had been wiped from his diary. However, I did speak to the political editor of the local newspaper here, the Express and Star. Peter Madeley thought the crime policies in the Queen's speech would appeal to potential Conservative voters. Though if the party does triumph in Dudley North come election day, whenever that is, he reckons it'll be that other subject what won it.
It's a massive Brexit area. It's nearly 70% Brexit. It's like a huge albatross that's just sort of hanging over above absolutely everything else. So while crime, I would say, is the major sort of, it's the issue of the day, the thing that people want to see sorted out more than anything is Brexit.
That was certainly the impression I was given at one of Dudley's retail landmarks. The Arcade Toy Shop has been in the town since 1930 and is now part-owned by David Carter.
What's being wrapped in there?
That's all designer baby goods. That item there is going to America. There's a lot more crime since the reduction in police numbers. Shoplifting, customers having knives pulled on them.
So what about tougher sentences for crimes, particularly violent crimes?
Stopping it in the first place is what needs to happen with more police. We haven't even got a police station in Dudley anymore.
What the government said today about cracking down on crime, is that going to lure you over to the Conservatives?
I think they need to get Brexit out of the way before they start waving promises under people's noses. And if you're in business, then it does mean a lot to you. They just need to get it done and dusted, and I don't really care what they do as long as they do something.
That report from Paul Moss. The sentencing of 9 Catalan separatist leaders to between 9 and 13 years in prison for sedition over their role in the 2017 independence referendum has led to angry scenes on the streets of Barcelona. 3 other defendants were found guilty of disobedience and fined, but they won't serve prison sentences. Earlier, thousands of demonstrators blockaded Barcelona's international airport, forcing the cancellation of some flights. Police charged protesters inside terminal buildings and tried to force them back with batons. The longest sentence of 13 years was handed to the former Vice President of Catalonia, Oriol Junqueras, for sedition and misuse of public funds. He accused Spain of jailing people for their political ideals and pledged that the separatists would return even stronger. A new arrest warrant was also issued for the former Catalan President, Carles Puigdemont, who is living abroad. He said the ruling was an act of revenge.
The Supreme Court ruling against the members of the government, the parliament and the most important social institutions in Catalonia confirms the strategy of repression and revenge against all the Catalan citizens who sought democratic ways to make their will possible.
Well, Spain's Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, said the sentences handed down to the separatist leaders represented an opportunity to move on, and he rejected accusations that the verdicts were the result of a political trial.
The government of Spain respects and abides by the decision of the Spanish Supreme Court, which puts an end to a judicial procedure meeting all requirements of due process, transparency and separation of powers. Nobody is above the law. Nobody is above the law. In a democracy like Spain, nobody is subject to trial for his or her ideas or politics, but rather for criminal conduct as provided by the law.
Well, Alfred Bosch is the Catalan Foreign Affairs Minister. He's calling for dialogue with the King and Prime Minister of Spain. He gave me his reaction to today's sentences.
This is a shame. And it's a shame for the Kingdom of Spain, but it will also be a shame for Europe, because here European standards for democracy and for human rights are being eroded. And we are seeing how 9 leaders, democratic leaders, will be sentenced for almost 100 years. They didn't commit a crime. What they did was hold a referendum so that the people could vote about their future.
Except that the court and the government in Madrid believe that holding a referendum was illegal, and they point to Article 1 of the Spanish Constitution, that national sovereignty belongs to the Spanish people.
Well, there might be a constitutional dispute, but you don't put people in jail because of that. Wherever in the civilized world similar claims have arisen, political solution has been found for people to decide in the polls. And that happened with Scotland. That also happened with Quebec. So we don't see why in the Kingdom of Spain the option would be a crackdown, hitting people on the head who are in the act of voting and sending thousands of police troops and putting people in jail, pushing them into exile, and sentencing these leaders, which are probably the most authorized leaders to lead talks and negotiations on the Catalan side. We don't see how that can improve things. In fact, it obviously worsens the situation.
There isn't much optimism from the judgment itself, though, for you. It described the 2017 independence bid as a mere pipe dream and talked about the imaginary right of self-determination.
Well, I think that right is enshrined in the United Nations Charter. So we have the right to decide about the future. We are free citizens. We are adults. This is not the Middle Ages. Goodness sake. We're in the 21st century in Western Europe. So there's a reasonable way to do this with common sense.
But how clear is it that you have a majority? If you look back to the last regional elections, you had a narrow majority, 47.5% of the vote. Is it clear that the majority of people in Catalonia support independence?
80% of the people in Catalonia, according to all polls, want to vote about a Catalan republic. That's a democratic majority that wants to go to the polls and decide. And they believe they are free citizens with full rights. And we're not better than any other nation, but we're not less than any other nation. So we're entitled to that.
The government in Madrid would point out that Catalonia already has extensive amounts of self-government, and essentially their role is to safeguard the country, to ensure that Spain remains a whole entity.
Well, sending people to jail for 100 years, keeping them in detention for 2 years without trial, pushing people into exile, and repression in general for hundreds of people who are being indicted and prosecuted. That's not exactly what I would call safeguarding a country or safeguarding rights or safeguarding democracy. That's exactly the opposite. And I insist, in other places in the 21st century, it's been solved in a completely different way, which is, in my opinion, the civilized way to do things.
The Catalan Foreign Minister, Alfred Bosch. And just one little bit of breaking news. The BBC understands that the cabinet meeting that was scheduled for tomorrow has been postponed and will now probably take place on Wednesday instead. Downing Street sources say it's to allow for a fuller update on Brexit. Excitement at the Booker Prize tonight. Margaret Atwood and Bernardine Evaristo have been named the joint winners. Rebecca Jones is at the Guildhall for us.
Excitement, very much so. Shock and disbelief in the room as well. No one had expected the prize to be divided between two authors, especially as the rules explicitly forbid it. But Peter Florence, the chair of the judges, said these two novels could not be compromised on, and therefore the only course of action was to flout the rules and divide the prize. And the jury was unanimous on that. So each author will take home £25,000 each. And I'm delighted to say that the two winners of the 2019 Booker Prize are here with me, Margaret Atwood and Bernardine Evaristo. Congratulations, first of all, to you both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Margaret Atwood, how surprised are you to be sharing the prize?
I'm very surprised to be winning it at all. I would have thought I was priced out of the market. I'm not in need of extra attention, shall we put it that way. So I'm very pleased to be sharing it. I thought it was a surprise. It was a surprise to win it and a surprise to share it, and I'm enormously pleased to be sharing it.
I have to tell the listeners at home that you're both standing here in front of me with your arms around each other. I'm feeling the love. Bernardine Evaristo, what's your reaction to sharing the prize?
Well, again, I'm just so delighted to be winning it, because it's so competitive and you just don't think you're going to win it ever. And then to win it and then to share it with a literary legend, Margaret Atwood, is just incredible. I just find this incredibly exciting, and I haven't really processed it yet, to be honest.
Margaret Atwood, you've made a bit of Booker history tonight. At the age of 79, you're the oldest winner of the prize, and you did touch on this. I mean, it's not going to make much difference to you, is it? Or is it?
Well, who knows? I mean, let's say my days on the planet, by the very nature of things, are not going to be as numerous as Bernadine's.
Yes.
So, career-wise, maybe not, but in terms of the book and what it's about, etc., etc., I think it does add something. And quite frankly, when a book is so widely read, there's a tendency to say it doesn't have literary value. So I'm delighted to have the endorsement in that area.
Yeah, and we should say that your book, The Testaments, has sold 250,000 copies in the UK alone since it was published, and that was only last month. Bernardine Evaristo, Girl, Woman, Other is your 8th novel. Yes. You're an established writer, but not necessarily a household name. Definitely I suspect not. In some ways this prize is going to make more of a difference to you.
I think that's absolutely. I think it's a game changer. It'll get my work out there. People will be reading it who wouldn't necessarily pick up my books. My books have literary merit, but they've never been bestsellers. And also, I've written about 12 black British women, and I just love the idea that more people are going to be encountering their lives and perhaps having a bit more empathy and understanding about people who aren't necessarily about themselves.
And are those characters that you think have been overlooked in fiction?
Definitely. There aren't many of us writing black British female characters in fiction at all. Maybe a handful of us a year, if that, are publishing books featuring black British women. So I think the fact that I've written 12 is, in fact, the reason I wrote 12 was to try and make up for that, to try and sort of have a book that has 12 characters, because there's such a dearth of us.
Yeah. And we ought to say you've also made Booker history tonight. You've become the first black woman to win the prize since its inception in 1969, which is quite startling, actually. Yes. Margaret, if I might just talk to you a wee bit about The Testaments, of course, the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, which was written more than 3 decades ago. Why did you feel the time was right now to revisit the repressive regime of Gilead that you've created?
Well, for a couple of decades after I wrote the book, I felt we were moving away from Gilead, and that The Handmaid's Tale would soon be an anachronism and a thing of the past. But then, not just in the United States, but in a number of other countries, we turned around and started going back towards Gilead. So because I'm such a screaming optimist, because I believe that such regimes don't last forever, although they may last longer than we would like, I wanted to go back and see how it fell apart, because we know that it did from The Handmaid's Tale, we just don't know how. So I wanted to go into that part of it.
Fantastic. Well, you've both written wonderful books. Margaret Atwood, Bernardine Evaristo, many congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Rebecca Jones at the Guildhall. What an extraordinary evening, and 2 great writers, I have to say. 4 years of generous welfare programmes and a campaign which promoted nationalist rhetoric and attacked LGBT rights delivered a second electoral victory for Poland's Law and Justice Party. It's increased its share of the vote for the lower house to 43%, the biggest share any party has won since the end of communism in 1989. But during the last term, reforms to Poland's judiciary put the party at loggerheads with the EU, which says the independence of Poland's judges is being eroded. But that doesn't seem to have dented Law and Justice's popularity with the electorate. Zdzisław Krasnodębski is a member of the European Parliament for Law and Justice. Krzysztof Śmiszek, we're not running that cliff. Krzysztof Śmiszek has just been elected as an MP for the opposition left-wing Spring Party, which is part of the left coalition.
It's not a great result for the all democratic opposition. However, we can see that Law and Justice had much higher expectations, so they counted on huge majority. The society didn't allow them to get such a huge result. And what's important, the left sides, the political left, got back to the Polish parliament. And I'm pretty sure that there will be a very strong democratic opposition.
You're putting a very positive gloss on the fact that Law and Justice have a majority majority in the House, and actually their policies of improving people's welfare provision and of a fairly nationalistic style rhetoric has proved to be very popular.
Yes, that's true. For the last 4 years, Law and Justice distributed a lot of money among society. We as left, we do support this kind of politics. However, Law and Justice is just distributing money, and at the same time, they are depriving people their liberties and freedoms.
But many people may say that they appreciate the fact their economic situation is being improved, something that's tangible, rather than the abstract idea of freedom.
I wouldn't say that freedom is an abstract idea for the Polish society. The results of the elections show that a lot of people, actually more than half of the society, supports democratic opposition. However, the good results of Law and Justice translated into a majority in the parliament. You have to remember that they have just 5 seats more than democratic opposition. So for the next 4 years, we have to do all we can do to change the perception of the politics and to change the perception of the society.
But many people would say one of the problems for the opposition has been that you're fragmented, and actually Law and Justice has a very clear message and actually is able to defeat the opposition, which isn't nearly so clear in its messaging and is divided.
Well, a few months ago we have European Parliament elections, and almost all democratic opposition got united, and still they lost. So Law and Justice was stronger. So this time, left went with left, center went with center, and I'm pretty sure that this is a very good starting point to build your own identity as a left, as center, as conservative, democratic conservatives. So I think it's a good path.
You and your partner, the leader of the Spring Party, Robert Biedron, have long campaigned for the rights of gay people in Poland. And one of the factors that was a big campaigning issue for Law and Justice was an anti-LGBT agenda. How does that make you feel about attitudes in Poland and about the direction of the country?
Well, you are right saying that the Law and Justice used the homophobic, transphobic card to divide the society. And, well, few years ago it worked out. However, now I can tell you that the public TV and public radio that were engaged by Law and Justice to spread the homophobia and transphobia in the society, it didn't work so well.
They won the election.
They won the election. However, when you look at the polls, you see that majority of Polish people support gay rights, support registered partnership bills. They even support gay marriages. Maybe not the majority, but still the numbers are growing. So this is a very clear sign that when you use homophobic, racist cards, it does not bring as many votes as you think. So Law and Justice has to change. They are using hate speech to divide the